Chapter 14. Wedding Bells. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. William Shakespeare. Reverend? The woman's voice came from the doorway to the church office. Even now, after taking over all of Reverend Thomas's duties completely for the past 2 years, Jeremy still didn't associate the title of Reverend with himself. He looked around for Reverend Thomas out of habit. But the old man had passed away in March, a withered, gibbering shadow of his former self. It was a hot day, the hottest yet this year, and Jeremy had just been wishing he was out under a tree, hanging out with the kids, watching them run and play. His head jerked back to the door, and a large drop of sweat that had been collecting along his forehead dripped into his left eye, momentarily blinding him in one eye, as he peered through his open right eye at Grace Wilkes's mother. Crap. Karen smiled tentatively at him as he wiped the sweat from his brow and cleared his left eye and motioned for her to come in. Good afternoon, Mrs. Wilkes. He stumbled a bit. The sermon he had been working on had been a difficult one, and it had apparently taken him through the morning and into the early afternoon, according to the antique clock in the corner of Jeremy's small office. The room was filled with Reverend Thomas's books and belongings. Jeremy kept looking at them and wondering if he should keep them or give them away. Reverend Thomas had never been married, never had children, and Jeremy was at a loss to find any known relatives. May I speak with you, Reverend? Jeremy winced at the title. He had never attended seminary and was unsure what the Methodist Church would have thought about him, a conflicted, half-agnostic and lapsed member of the Church of Christ. Half the time he wasn't sure he believed in God, but it sure seemed to reassure some of the older crowd. Please, call me Jeremy. Karen smiled. Well, I guess, considering you and Grace and everything. Jeremy winced. He knew what was coming next. Grace turned 19 last month, you know. Yes, ma'am, I know. Don't you dare ma'am me, Jeremy Deeds. I'm barely 2 years older than you, and you know it. Jeremy's discomfort grew. Karen smiled again, perhaps to show him her words were just that, words, and that she wasn't offended. It feels strange coming here, though, because it should be Anthony here, the right of the father to speak about his daughter and all that. She looked around the tiny room and tugged at her clothes, which were clinging from the miserably humid heat. Shall we go outside? Sure. Jeremy stood up. The heat actually felt good in his legs. It was the winters that were the worst for him. He could predict bad weather better than the old-timers from the strong aches he felt in his damaged legs. But in the summer there was some relief, as if the sun could reach through the skin and muscle and warm the irrevocably damaged bones beneath. Still, it wasn't easy to walk far, no matter what. They walked slowly out the door. The sun was bright overhead and the waves of heat rippled across the empty parking lot. Grace and the orphans were nowhere to be found. Perhaps they had gone to the creek to swim. It certainly was a good day for it. Karen pointed to a tree 100 feet away, and they walked over to it and sat down. Before Karen could say anything, Jeremy said, Mrs. Wilkes. Call me Karen. Fine, Karen. I just wanted you to know that I've never done anything inappropriate with Grace, he said, fumbling over the right words to say. Her loud peal of laughter surprised him. And well, I know that. She smiled and looked concerned. Is that what you thought I was doing here? Warning you away from her? Jeremy had a hard time meeting her eyes. Do you like Grace, Jeremy? Her question was soft. Of course I do. I mean, she's a great help around here. And the kids love her, and she was a great comfort and help with Reverend Thomas, especially in those last days. But do you like her? Mrs. Wilkes. He couldn't manage the informality of her first name to such a serious question. This was Grace's mother he was talking to. I'm 39 years old, and Grace is... And Grace is an adult capable of love, Karen interrupted. At his shocked expression, she smirked a bit. I didn't choose you, she did, and 20 years between you is a sight better than the 23 years that separated me from my Anthony. That marriage worked just fine. Her eyes filled, right up to the end of our time together. She shook her head, choking back the memory of her husband lying dead on the ground. It had been 6 years, and yet it had been the blink of an eye. The loss of him had not abated. She still expected to see him walk through the door, or be there in bed with her when she woke up at night. I'm not in judgment of you, and I'm less worried about the age difference than you apparently are. She stared into his eyes. What I want to know is this. Is the love that Grace feels for you returned? Do you feel for her as she feels for you? He started to stammer out a response, and she stopped him. I've put you on the spot, and that isn't fair, so listen to me and think about it. Grace is in love with you. She has been for years. He started to disagree, and she stopped him with a wave of her finger. You think she is too young to know what she wants, but she isn't. She was practically a mute when I sent her to you. The only time I heard anything from her was at night, when she would scream from the nightmares of remembering that awful day. I didn't know what to do, but I knew she was lost, and I hurt so much from losing Anthony that I could barely help myself, much less her. Karen stopped for a moment, collected the emotions threatening to burst out now. Even after all this time, the wounds were fresh. She gazed at the horizon, and in the distance they could see the children returning, tumbling through the grass. In a few moments they would be back in the church parking lot. I sent her to you, Jeremy, because I remember your face when you saw her that day, sitting out on the back porch. And you helped her. Both you and the Reverend did, but mostly you. She focused in on you like you were her own private lifeboat. At first, yes, when she first started talking about marrying you, I dismissed it too. She was a child, with simple beliefs and a good heart. But as these years have passed, she's grown up and never deviated from it. She's waiting for you to reciprocate. So you think about that, Reverend Deeds, and let me know if my daughter's feelings for you are something you can return. Jeremy squirmed again at the title of Reverend. Please, I really wish everyone would stop calling me that. Karen shook her head. You are the Reverend here now, you know. Long before Reverend Thomas passed, you were doing his job, and we all know that. Let your parishioners call you Reverend Deeds. It's for them, not for you. And with that piece of advice, she hugged him, then got up and walked off, leaving him to sit under the large oak tree with a completely new point of view. She was gone before Grace and the kids returned, and he couldn't help but smile when one of them flung herself into his arms, half damp and covered in grass. Colette, the youngest, just an infant when her father and mother died during the assault by a faction of the Western Front on the tiny town of Tiptonville, giggled as she squirmed in his lap. She was an adorable child, with her curly red hair and lively brown eyes. Mr. Jeremy, we went swimming in the creek and I catched a crawdad, but Miss Grace said I had to put it back. She pouted slightly, her eyes dancing with mischief. Quite right. Jeremy smiled down at the child, and then flashed a smile up at Grace. Leave that crawdad in his home. Besides, you are lucky he didn't pinch you, he said, eliciting a scream as he tickled her side, and with that, the rest of the kids dove in and began wiggling, tickling, and shrieking in Jeremy's lap, while Grace looked on and shook her head in mock disapproval. Jeremy looked up during the ruckus and caught Grace staring at him with a look he hadn't seen before, or perhaps it was better to say he hadn't bothered to notice. It seemed that, when Grace came around, he spent a great deal of time looking at everyone else but her. And why was that? Why was he so worried about what others thought of him? Or of her? This thought continued to plague him, through an early dinner, through the evening games and storytelling, through the baths and bedtime rituals, and he found himself sneaking glances at her throughout the evening. Grace was petite, like her mother, with curly brown hair and big blue eyes. She still slept in the girls' dorm every Monday through Thursday night, and went back to the family farm Friday evenings after supper, returning early Monday in time to help him fix breakfast for the kids. Today she was wearing a pair of patched and tattered jean shorts and a short-sleeved top. She was slim, and seeing her in a new light after Karen's visit still had him feeling like he was some kind of pervert. There were 20 years between them, for crying out loud, and he felt wrong just looking at her that way. Just then, as the last of the kids were put to bed and they were alone, tidying up the communal living spaces, Grace turned to ask him a question and caught him staring at her. Jeremy's face flamed red and he quickly turned away. For crying out loud, he was 39 years old, and here he was blushing like a pimply-faced teenager trying to get to first base. He was so busy trying to hide the flush on his face that he missed the big grin that lit her face at his sudden interest. It would be 2 weeks before he mustered the courage to visit Karen Wilkes and answer her question on how he felt about her daughter, and another 5 more before the church was able to play the wedding march for the couple. Despite Jeremy's fears, none of the townsfolk or members of the church had concerns about the age difference. Too many things had changed in the world, and if the Reverend was happy and Grace was happy, then they were too. In the years to come, the disparate age gap would matter little, and the couple, their adopted children, all orphans, and their 2 biological children, would be instrumental in bringing healing to the community.